But the real reason we're here tonight is for Professor Knox, and I have to say that for me it's a special privilege. I happen to be a 1987 graduate of the first class of women at Columbia College with an art history degree in Quattrocento Italian art. But I also learned this evening that, like myself, who was a refugee to Wall Street after her college career, the same can be said for Professor Knox, who worked for 10 years at Chase before making her own career shift into the arts, and that's very exciting for us all to know. Paige Knox is an adjunct professor of art history in the Department of Art History at Columbia, where she received her PhD in 2012. She works in a variety of capacities at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, including public gallery talks, lectures, and an incredibly exciting travel trip to Amboise and to France that I noticed I wish we could all take with you. Hopefully you'll do that again.
I wish you could all come too, but they're all getting canceled.
Yes. We'll do virtual tours with you. There's an opportunity in every crisis page. Tonight she will speak to us about Leonardo in Florence, and please join me in welcoming Paige Knox.
Thank you so much. I believe I think this is working. Can everybody hear me? Okay, I'm going to switch out of New Canaan and transform us from New Canaan to Florence. Here we go. Terrific. And thank you. I'm so thrilled to see so many people. Only Leonardo can defy the coronavirus and get people out here. As I was saying, I've had a lot of Met trips that I've done in the past. I actually did, this lecture is partly inspired by a trip that I did last summer, which was following the trail of Leonardo. It was the 500th anniversary of his death, so there were celebrations going on throughout Italy in the year 2019, and we were able to take advantage of a number of very unique opportunities in following him from Vinci all the way through to Florence, Milan, Rome, and then ultimately to his resting place in France in Amboise. And a similar trip was planned for this spring for Caravaggio, starting in Milan, and of course we were going to go visit the Last Supper. That trip is being reconsidered as we speak. So I told the Met to tell everyone to come to New Canaan. They can see the Last Supper here. They don't have to worry about problems with Corona. So anyway, I greatly appreciate being here, and I'm thrilled to share this material. Now, when we were deciding what we were going to talk about, Leonardo is such a large and tremendous subject. We thought that we would focus on Florence, just to give you a sense of Leonardo's relationship with this city, which was so integral to his own personal development as well as the life of the artists who preceded him and who followed him. And so essentially, what I'm going to try to also kind of bring alive to you in the images are the two time periods in which he lived there and how the city in many ways became a vital source for him, but also how he then gave back to the city, and it became a real sort of blessed pilgrimage to people who really appreciate Leonardo. So if you know the life of Leonardo, he spent two very pivotal time periods in Florence. The first between 1464 and 1482, and we're going to be discussing a lot of these paintings. This is a time of apprenticeship, this is a time of learning, this is a time of growing. He will then head to Milan, where he'll create his Last Supper, and he will return back to Florence between 1500 and 1506. And this will arguably be one of the most prolific periods of his life, of his career. So I'm going to look at those two periods, but really delve into three works, rather specifically, works that were created in Florence and that ultimately stayed with him, two of them, till the end of his years, which he took to when he took them to France. So we're going to be looking in depth in St. Jerome, the Mona Lisa, and the Virgin and St. Anne. But first of all, I'd like to give you a little just background on Leonardo, where he came from, the time period in which he was born, and again, the impact of Florence on his early years. So as I said, we've been celebrating the 500th anniversary of his death in 1519, but he was born in 1452 in a very small village called Anciano. It's not even really a village. It's more of just a collection of farmhouses. And he was born in very unique circumstances. His father, Ser Piero, was a very well-known figure in the town of Vinci. He was an important businessman. He was a notary. He was someone that was highly respected in the community, as had been his father and his grandfather. And he was betrothed to a woman, and yet in the midst of all this, he met Caterina, who was the mother of Leonardo, a peasant girl, and that's the story. It's fairly accurate in the sense that she was from a very different class of from Ser Piero. There was a love relationship, we believe, and out of this relationship came the love child Leonardo, and we believe that he was born in this very small country house. And if you go to right now, you can see there are all these wonderful little plaques that basically pay homage to the birthplace of Leonardo. By the way, Leonardo is a true god in Italy. He is highly revered by all. And when we were traveling on this trip, the crowds that showed up were amazing. We went to the town of Vinci, and normally you go to Vinci, there's 10 people in Vinci, nobody's ever on the streets, very quiet. There were 5,000 German tourists in Vinci. It was unbelievable. But we went to see the birthplace where he grows up, and of course his early childhood spent in Vinci with his family. His father, this is very important because he is illegitimate, and his father never recognizes him as a member of the family. And this actually can work quite to his benefit, because as an illegitimate child, he wasn't expected to follow in the footsteps of the notary. And if you are familiar with the Quattrocento, it was sort of a good time to be illegitimate. There were a lot of important individuals who, because of their illegitimacy, they were able to achieve things that they would not have been able to do. And Leonardo certainly is a part of that group, that time period. And so as a child, he has a very sort of free-form education, a lot of which is spent roaming the hills of Vinci and very much being open to the natural world. And that's something that's going to stay with him for the rest of his life. This love of this countryside, of the Tuscan countryside. And one of the, did anybody get a chance to go to the Leonardo show in Paris? Did anybody get there? Well, I was fortunate enough to take 2 Met groups through that show, and this was one of the first works that greeted you when you entered the show, one of his earliest drawings that was done when he becomes a member of the Artists Guild in Florence. But it's a study of a Tuscan landscape. And I think this drawing is such an important indicator of Leonardo's willingness to observe the natural world around him and how this landscape remains embedded in his mind. And you're going to see this landscape reappearing and reappearing in numerous paintings. But the study was actually on view when we went to Vinci, because many people believe this is sort of the backyard of where he grew up as a child. Now, as I said, he had a fairly open, sort of very free-form childhood, but there comes a time, as always, when you've got to get to work. And with that, his father recognizes that his son has a talent. He's a fairly talented draftsman, and so he sends him to Florence and basically wants to introduce him to the art world and get him involved working for an important workshop. Now, this is where I really want to kind of give you a sense of why Florence is such an important city, and it's such a vital place for Leonardo to come of age in. So this time period is really a moment of great flowering in the arts. And it goes back to, these artists that I'm showing you here, some of you may be familiar with Botticelli, Fra Angelico, Fra Filippo Lippi. These are all artists that were generally working at the time when Leonardo arrives in Florence. But prior to that, you had 3 major figures in the beginning of the Quattrocento, the 1400s, the 15th century, who were monumental in changing the way art was created and the way that people thought about art, talked about art, practiced art, and basically viewed art. And those were the sort of great threesome of Masaccio, Brunelleschi, and Donatello. So Brunelleschi, the designer of the dome, was someone that was very interested in rethinking classical architecture, bringing that idiom back as a vital style that was very important to his patron, the Medici. Of course, you cannot talk about Florence without talking about the Medici. And so Brunelleschi went to Rome, and in order to create drawings of famous classical buildings that he wanted to bring back to Florence, he developed a technique called scientific perspective. which was basically a means by which one could create a three-dimensional object on a two-dimensional surface. And this will have enormous repercussions for all of the artists working at this time period. It will have tremendous repercussions for sculptors, people like Donatello, who bring a new sense of naturalism and realism in the way they start to create images of individuals. And it will also speak very directly to painters. So Masaccio, being part of this first generation of artists in Florence, very much aware of what Brunelleschi is doing. And by the way, it's not only this combination of the three, but you also have a man named Alberti, who's writing a treatise called On Painting. And this treatise basically brings all of these ideas that are happening in sculpture and are happening in architecture, and he codifies them, he writes them down. So it's always unclear whether Masaccio has read Alberti or Alberti is looking at Masaccio. But these ideas start to become very vital. And one of the things that Alberti says in On Painting is how important a historia is, a history painting. It needs to tell a story, and that story needs to be told in the position of the figures, in their gestures, in their mannerisms. And those figures need to look naturalistic. And so they need to be placed in space appropriately. So in order to achieve this, you have to basically use some of these devices. So one of the things, as I mentioned, scientific perspective, developed by Brunelleschi to recreate architectural drawings, but they come in very handy when you're trying to create a three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface. And you can see the use of that perspective very clearly in Masaccio. Another technique that gets discussed and really starting to be developed at this time is the technique of chiaroscuro. And that basically means light and dark. The use of light, how important it is to use shadow, and you can sort of see how this figure shown in light and in shadow adds to the naturalism of the body and adds to the movement and the discussion that's going on between these individuals. Now, you may know the story. This is the story, it's called The Tribute Money, and it is a story about paying your taxes. This is a moment, yes, I know. I was going to try to tie this into donations to the New Canaan Library, but I can really figure out how I can do that. But here comes the development officer. No, I'm just kidding. Here comes the tax collector. And basically, he says to Christ, you know, you have to pay your taxes. This is something that everybody does. Doesn't matter who you are. You have to pay up. And Christ says, well, you know, I don't have any money. I don't have any money to pay the tax collector. And you can see, again, thinking about this importance of gesture, they're worried, right? Whoa. And then he says, hey, Peter, go over to the river and pull a coin out of the fish's mouth. And Peter says, are you crazy? So there are all these marvelous gestures that take place. And ultimately, of course, he does find the... He's able to go and retrieve the gold coin out of the fish's mouth and then bring it to pay the tax collector. So we're having a story that is told here. And this is a work that Leonardo will look at very closely when he spends his early years in Florence. He also will look at Masaccio's portraits. And Masaccio is the beginning of portraiture. Really, no one had their portraits painted of the average, bourgeois type of individual. It was really just, portraiture was basically just for the royals and for religious figures. And so this is this moment where you start to have this new merchant class that starts to want to have their portrait painted. And with that, the rise of certain artists become very prolific at creating these images. Now, as I said, Masaccio, we see here the male figure in profile, but what you'll really recognize are certain artists, Fra Filippo Lippi being one of them, who perfected the art of the female portrait. And this is a classic female Renaissance portrait. She's in profile, she doesn't look at you, she has a lot of jewelry. Basically, we're in Florence, which is the center of the wool and cloth industry. And so what the individual wears is very important statement about her family. Basically, the sitter is a site of display. And you see that in all of the wonderful, I happen to adore these portraits, some of which are at the Met. But basically, it was the idea that you're not interested in her personality. You're really much more interested in what she's wearing. Some things don't change. But essentially, it's all about the attire. It's all about the jewels. It's all about the hairstyle. No engagement with the soul in any way. And so I want you to remember all these things because this is the style that is introduced to Leonardo when he comes to Florence. Now, when he arrives in Florence, his father, Ser Piero, very well connected, gets him a job in the workshop of Verrocchio. Now, Verrocchio is primarily known as a sculptor, but he was at the time most well known for the workshop because he had a tremendous group of artists working for him at the time, all of whom would go on to have very illustrious careers. So people like Botticelli, Perugino, Ghirlandaio, all the great second generation artists are all in Verrocchio's studio at this very prolific, wonderful moment. It's just the Renaissance is full speed ahead. And they're creating these amazing objects, and essentially Verrocchio participates in this, primarily, as I said, as a sculptor. And one of his most well-known objects is this image of the David. Now, this piece was very much in dialogue with the earlier David by Donatello. It will be put in dialogue with the later David of Michelangelo. But what I love about this piece, in addition to it representing a young Renaissance prince who's the new David, is that when this piece was made, Leonardo was working in the workshop, and people think it's a self-portrait of Leonardo. So Leonardo was very good looking. Apparently he had great, and he had fabulously curly hair. And it was one of his obsessions. He was always obsessed with curling hair. And a great physique. He was just known as a very, very attractive young man. And so we tend to sort of, whenever I look at this, I always feel like I'm seeing the young Leonardo. Now, if you made it to the Paris show, which nobody did, but you walked into the Leonardo exhibition, the first thing you saw was this sculpture by Verrocchio of Christ and the doubting Thomas, who's sticking his finger in his wound. And so essentially surrounding this were particular drawings done by Leonardo in the workshop of Verrocchio that were all about understanding the human form through studying sculpture. And they actually recreated one of these sort of models. This was what would go on in the workshop. They'd have a sculpture and they would take wet linens and they would lay them over the sculpture, and essentially the artist would practice the art of drawing. And it was a way, and you can see this wonderful early drawing by Leonardo of showing light and dark. And again, the use of chiaroscuro, the use of shadow. You can see Leonardo is learning from those past artists and really moving far ahead of them. So one of the things that you'll see is the connection between Leonardo and Verrocchio on the canvas in this image of the baptism of Christ. It's a painting that's at the Uffizi, and we tend to look at it more for the contribution that Leonardo made to the painting than the work done by Verrocchio. One of the things that also took place at the exhibition were these wonderful infrared reflectograms, and they're basically X-rays of paintings that allow you to get behind the paint, to get behind the pigments, to look at the drawings that were underneath. And of course, disegno and drawing, such a vital part of Florentine approach to painting. And through these infrareds, there was discovery. Generally, it's accepted that Leonardo did this figure. And you can always tell it's Leonardo because of that wonderful curly hair. Really was, I've been trying to straighten mine for years, but he just loved the curls. But the infrared suggested, and this is Vincent Delavue, who's I highly admire, I'm not totally sure I agree, that this portion of the body of Christ was done by Leonardo. So there's always new discoveries going on about Leonardo. But the myth about the painting, which is there are lots of myths about Leonardo, but many of them come from Vasari's book on the life of the artist. If you know Giorgio Vasari, he chronicles the history of all the major painters in Florence, from Giotto all the way up to Michelangelo. And he has a lot of important facts, but there's a lot of juicy gossip, and there are a lot of wonderful stories. And one of the stories goes that after Verrocchio saw the angel, he put down the brush. And he said, "Never shall I pick up a paintbrush. The student has exceeded the master, and I'm done." So I don't know if that's true or not, but that's the story as it's understood. But you start to see Leonardo, and he works in the workshop of Verrocchio for a very, very long time. I mean, he's there for over 15 years, and he spends a great deal of time doing these kinds of, portions of paintings. The first painting that we believe he actually does by himself is the Annunciation. And by the way, I should tell you that there's a lot of debate about authentic Leonardo paintings. Some people say Leonardo only painted 8 paintings. Some people raise that number to approximately 30, and then there's some gray area. Some people have debated this work. It's at the Uffizi, and it's generally recognized as his first painting done by himself. It's not, you can tell he's not fully grown, he's not gotten the style that he's known for, but there are elements, particularly his fascination with the natural world down here in the garden, and that smoky landscape that you're going to keep seeing. So those things are classic Leonardo's. The figures, he's working on them, but of course, it's early days for him. Another painting that is the only painting by Leonardo that's in America is Ginevra Da Vinci. And she was not an aristocrat, she was a wife of a merchant. And it's often believed that this painting was a larger portrait, but that it was cut off at the bottom. But it's one of the first commissioned portraits that we know of. We believe it was actually meant for not her husband, but an admirer, Bernardo Bembo, who had written sonnets about Ginevra. And Ginevra's name in Italian is a play on juniper. So she's surrounded with juniper berries. But it is one of the first portraits that you see where we are removing the profile and we're turning towards the viewer. And it's a really important statement in understanding the development of the female portrait in the Renaissance. And of course, there you have the wonderful curly hair. Now, one of the things that was, when you went to the Louvre show, it was really disconcerting because these infrareds showed you these pictures you've seen over and over and over for years in a slightly different form. And what was interesting about the infrared, it showed pouncing. It's hard to see. I don't know if you can see this from far away, but there are these little holes that were put in drawings to, in other words, suggesting that Leonardo made a sketch of her, took the sketch and then pounced it and created the lines under the canvas and then worked from that. So suggesting that there was a drawing that went with this tied to Ginevra. But it is a very important example of early portraiture during this first period in Florence. And then you have his major tour de force work, which is the Adoration of the Magi. Now this was a painting that it was, in 1478, this group came to Leonardo and basically offered him this very important commission for an altarpiece. This was a big deal for him, and he started working on it. He never finishes it, so it's what we call non finito. And some people actually prefer the non finito because it allows you to see the hand of the artist, and you absolutely are seeing this intense chiaroscuro, this, we call it sfumato, the smokiness, the dark and the light that Leonardo is so well known for. You see him really beginning to master that in this image. The painting did not make it to the exhibition in Paris, but the very famous drawing did. And this is a drawing that underscores this engagement with perspective. Remember I was saying Brunelleschi, those drawings, those architectural studies of scientific perspective, you can see how Leonardo takes it next level. So really bringing the early Renaissance into the mid-Renaissance and ultimately bringing this into the high Renaissance. So it's a painting that demonstrates his awareness of these techniques that were that have been being discussed throughout the century. And this was also a phenomenal reflectogram that was actually I was able to see this first when we went to Florence, and they were repairing this painting, they were restoring it. And in order to restore it, they used this reflectogram, and a lot of things were revealed. One, which I think is the most interesting, is that people have always sort of wondered about this figure here, who everybody else is looking at the three kings and the Magi and the Virgin and the Child, but this figure, a repoussoir figure is sort of, again, thinking about how the gestures of the different individuals bring you into the story. So technically, this guy is correctly looking this way, but this fellow is looking the other way. Doesn't make sense. And many people think this is self-portrait of Leonardo. And some people have suggested that he's looking the other way because he's thinking of moving on, thinking about the next chapter. Now, there are two other works that you should be familiar with from the period. This is the Benoit Madonna. This is also a contested work. Not everyone believes it's by Leonardo, but it actually comes from St. Petersburg, and it ended up making its way up to Russia in the 19th century, actually went into the collection of Rimsky-Korsakov, given to the Russians, to the Tsar's collection, and now in the Hermitage. And the reason it's so exciting to see this is, as you know, the Russians will not lend works to the United States. So if you want to see this painting, you're going to have to either go to St. Petersburg or see it at the Louvre. And again, this was the reflectogram. This was again, giving you lots of new information. And then the final painting, which I'm going to spend more time on at the end of the lecture, is St. Jerome. And this was a painting that he begins when he is leaving Florence, and he comes back to it. And that's one of the themes about Leonardo that I think is so important. The show brought this out, is that many people criticize Leonardo for not finishing things. He has ADD, he's not able to pay attention, he moves on to the next. But what the show wanted to say, and I think it's a really accurate way of thinking about Leonardo, is that you can't really even look at these works as individuals. They're all building towards a whole, a composite. And he's always working, he's always thinking, he always never sees anything as finished because there's always more to learn. And I think St. Jerome, so wait for it, and we'll get back to him in a moment. So if you were at the Louvre show, there's St. Jerome on the right, there's the Benoit Madonna on the left, and then we move to Milan. So this is a moment when the thing about Leonardo is, unfortunately, not like many of his counterparts like Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, he's not able to procure the support of the Medici. So he never feels like he has the grand patron who is offering him substantial work. So he starts to look around. Who can he attract? Whose court can he go to? And he finds Ludovico Sforza. And this is not part of my talk, but the Milan period is so integral to understanding Leonardo. He leaves Florence, goes to Milan, and will spend 18 years in Milan working for the Sforzas. Ludovico is a warlord, very similar to the great leaders of the Renaissance, such as the Duke of Urbino, who basically gained power through violence, gained power through particular types of warfare, and then want to create a court that's devoted to arts and culture. And you can always recognize him. He's Il Moro. Everybody knows him by his hairstyle. And I always just can't resist throwing this in because everybody always says, where did Ringo Starr get it? He got it from Ludovico Sforza. There's just a few, I know. Because how can I work the Ringo into this? But anyway, just to give you a sense of, Milan is very crucial to Leonardo. He does some of his most beloved paintings in Milan. The Virgin of the Rocks, this particular version at the Louvre. My favorite, Cecilia Gallerani, who is the mistress of Ludovico, holding her ermine. Of course, Ludovico has just been ushered into the Order of the Ermine, so this is a very seductive portrait. And, you know, she was the most beautiful woman at court, because you've got to be beautiful to look good in that cap. Another important, La Belle Ferronnière, this is another mistress of Ludovico. This particular painting now resides in the Louvre in Abu Dhabi. So there's some very important works. And also, this is when Leonardo's beginning to work on some of his most important discoveries. And, you know, as I said, it's an ongoing story, the mind of Leonardo. But botany, optics, astronomy, all of these wonderful codexes. And we have a lot of information about Leonardo, because he does put it down on paper. So we have 7,000 sheets of paper by Leonardo at our disposal, and always learning more from him. And of course, the most famous piece of paper, the Old Vitruvian Man. So again, done in Milan, not part of our conversation, but you just have to, and this was, in the Vitruvian Man, after much discussion, made it to the show. There was a lot of back and forth between the Italian government and the French government, and ultimately reason prevailed, and the Vitruvian Man came for a 6-week period, and then he heard about the coronavirus and went back to Italy. And then, of course, the Last Supper, which is the subject upstairs, which I won't talk about, but an absolute tour de force. And what you're seeing in this painting is the culmination of all the things that Leonardo had learned in Florence, coming into this one painting. this idea of disegno, the idea of scientific perspective, the idea of gesture, the idea of composition, all these things telling the story of betrayal and resurrection, all embedded into this one painting. So 1500, politically things get very challenging. The French invade Milan, and Leonardo decides it's time to go back home. So he returns to Florence, but Florence has been badly shaken as well. During the time that he has been in Milan, the great Il Magnifico has passed away in 1492 to be taken with the city taken over by Savonarola, this heretical leader, this monk who was very much about getting rid of all of the engagement with painting and sculpture and architecture, the adoration of the of antiquities, bonfire of the vanities. He wants to get rid of all of that, and of course, ultimately, he meets his own death. So when Leonardo comes back to Florence, Florence is now a republic, but it's been shaken. It's been tested. So it's a young, early, eager republic, eager to have artists that are going to start creating projects to glorify Florence in a new chapter of the city. Now, Leonardo will reside in the Santissima Annunciata, which is a great, lovely church, if you're familiar with Florence. It's right near the Accademia. And he and his entourage, he has, various followers. He has some close friends. He is absolutely overtly homosexual. His Salai, his companion, is with him here. And I love the fact that Leonardo moves back in 1500 because there's a great deal written about how very flamboyant he was. He wore pink capes and purple sashes and strutted around. Everyone said, there goes Leonardo. Of course, he would never have been able to do that during the time of Savonarola. So he's kind of in Florence at this right time and reconnecting with his family. His father has subsequently had 4 wives and multiple children who are all, Leonardo is old enough to be their father. It takes 20 years for Leonardo's father to finally have more children, but there's a whole group of them, and Leonardo reconnects with them, but really begins to engage in some of his most prolific work. And I'm just going to give you a sense of a few of these things. One is a portrait that he does of Isabella d'Este, who's arguably the most important female patron of the day. Her sister was married to the Sforza, Ludovico, and she had always wanted Leonardo to do a portrait of her. And she actually she's from Mantova, and she has a very tremendous court there. Leonardo kind of toys with her. She comes to Florence to beg him to paint her portrait, and he ultimately rejects her. So there's a lot of this intrigue going on with Isabella d'Este during this time. She was so desirous of a portrait that she actually contacted Cecilia Gallerani and said, "Can I have yours for a while?" Cecilia sent it with the code, that had to come back. So ultimately, she did return it in hopes that Leonardo would make her look as beautiful, but Leonardo really didn't want to have to pander to this patron who was going to tell him what to do. And of course, you can see when she had her portrait painted, she is aristocracy, so she's going to be painted in profile. And I think Leonardo just wasn't willing to go there. He realized the importance of the 3/4 view, of the female engaging with her viewer. So it's an interesting sort of moment in the history of his time, the second period in Florence, where he refuses to pander to the wants and the needs of the aristocracy. Now, many people actually think this is one of Leonardo's best works. It's at the Louvre, and it underwent a 12-year restoration a couple of years ago. And it's a painting that, when you see it, compared to what it looked like before, the colors are extremely vibrant. But it was a painting that has a very misunderstood history. It was a painting that was commissioned by the church where he was living, but there was also a drawing that preceded it, a cartone, that's the name of the drawing that precedes the painting. And this cartone was shown in Florence, and it was all the rage. People came from all around to see this cartone of Leonardo. In fact, somebody like Raphael, very much looking at this cartone and writing about it and talking about this influence of this pyramidal structure and the spiral. So that's a whole nother thing that begins to get developed in Leonardo's work, this spiraling forms as they make their way. And you see this gesture which is a gesture of upward movement, a gesture of to the heavens of the spirit of Christ and God. But Leonardo or Raphael takes it to great effect in the Madonnas that he will make in Florence, also in this first decade. It's a very prolific time to be in Florence. But the problem is, when you look at this, they're different, right? It's not the same. So there's been a lot of discussion about this, and what ultimately has been decided, or the theory that's been agreed upon, came about in a show at the London National Gallery where they brought these two together. And the idea is actually that this particular drawing was done when he was leaving Milan. And when he was leaving, Louis XII, who was married to Anne of Brittany, had invaded. And so this is the Virgin and Saint Anne. And that was probably who he was making it for. But he had to leave Milan, and he probably did another drawing that was displayed and lost, and then the ultimate image here, you remove the figure of John the Baptist and you insert the lamb. And the lamb basically represents the passion. So in all of these images of the Christ child with the virgin, there's always some suggestion of the future. What's going to happen in the end of Christ's life. So there's a reference to that. And one of the things that people love about this painting is it speaks to these years of study by Leonardo about sedimentary rocks and the idea of, the floor of the stone and why is the sky blue? Leonardo's always asking these questions and referencing them in his drawings, and then these drawings and these ideas then infiltrate into the paintings. And he figured the sky was blue because of the vapor of the water, which is interesting. Now, when you see this, of course, Freud got very involved in this painting because he thought it was indicative of Leonardo's relationship with his mother. That Leonardo had a real mother, and Leonardo also had these stepmothers. And so this is Leonardo wrestling with mother, stepmother. Where does he fit in with all of this? And Freud actually read an excerpt that Leonardo wrote about a bird flying into his crib as a child. And it's a great sort of art history goof because Freud translated the bird as a vulture. It was a sparrow. And then Freud looked at the painting and found the vulture. No vulture. I think it says more about Freud than it does about Leonardo. So be careful when you have psychoanalysis on a painter who's been dead for 500 years. But there is also some wonderful images of drawings. This is the head. At the Met, we have this marvelous drawing of the head of the Virgin. And you see that sfumato and the use of that fabulous, the curling hair. So really tremendous images that come out of this very wonderful painting. And there's the drawing at the cartone at the show. A couple of other famous episodes in Florence. Leda and the Swan. We know this was an actual oil painting that was created. It went to France. The story goes that when it arrived in France, it was treasured by Francis I. It went into the Louvre's collection, and the mistress / second unofficial wife of Louis XIV, Madame de Maintenon, thought it was scandalous and had it burned. We don't know if that's true, but this was a copy that was made by Francesco Melzi, who was in the workshop of Leonardo, and ultimately who Leonardo will adopt as a son. And so many people see this as indicative of fertility and having offspring, because Leda and Zeus, who transforms himself into a swan to seduce her, they give birth to Castor and Pollux, and also to Helen of Troy and Clytemnestra. So you can blame the whole Trojan War on Zeus as a swan. But what I love about the Leda is the drawings. That curly hair, you just gotta love it. I mean, absolutely so beautiful. And I think, you wonder, what did that painting look like? It's really sad. Another very, very infamous work that's made in Florence at this time is good old Salvator Mundi. I know you know a lot about this painting. There's a lot of controversy about it. It was recently sold. It's the most expensive painting in the world to $450 million. It's now supposedly either on a yacht in the Red Sea or in a vault in Switzerland. It was supposed to come to the show, didn't make it. And it's very contested. I mean, it's an image of Christ as the savior of the world. Carmen Baumbach actually believes that, she's at the Met, and I so admire her, and I really do take her word as gospel. She thinks that Leonardo may have worked on the hands, but she doesn't think it's Leonardo because of this orb. And the orb, if you know anything about optics, which Leonardo knew a lot about, if you look at an orb, you look through an orb, things get turned upside down. So technically, it's incorrect. So if Leonardo was going to do this, he probably, knowing Leonardo, he knew a lot about optics. And these are some of the pages where he's talking about these kinds of orbs and how concave and convex lenses work. So I don't know. I'm going to leave it to you to decide. Also, during this time, he works for Cesare Borgia. So the very infamous son of the Borgia Pope, who was had a very illustrious career, but he becomes this kind of condottieri. He becomes like one of those warlords, and he starts to try to take over parts of the papal states. And he hires Leonardo to work for him, and Leonardo makes these fabulous maps that are very forward-thinking. If you think about aerial mapping and how it's been used in warfare. So this is another element of Leonardo's time in Florence, and he's working for this very unusual figure in the Renaissance. And he will also be holed up in Imola, this is the map of Imola, with Cesare in a five-block town, Leonardo, Cesare Borgia, and Machiavelli. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall with those three. He's also hired by Florence to basically come up with ways to outwit the Pisans. So instead of going to war, what are we going to do? How are we going to defeat our enemy? We're going to divert the Arno River. It was a great idea. Didn't really work out, but you got to give them a lot of credit because they actually were out digging and trying to create these trenches. And you got to think big if you're going to be somebody like Leonardo. Also, during his time in Florence, the second period, he investigates the flight of birds, and also then gets very interested in flying apparatuses. And one of the other things that's quite substantial is where he's staying is 3 blocks away from the hospital, and he meets this 100-year-old man who says he's never been sick a day in his life, and he dies. And he gives Leonardo permission to basically do a dissection. And Leonardo learns all about the parts of the body. And it's really a fantastic dissection that gives him information about things that he's been pondering for many years. And the final project that he engages in, which was so sad because it's lost, is the Battle of Anghiari. And this is a project that was commissioned by the Florentine government to go into the walls. This is in the Palazzo Vecchio. This is the council hall room. And the great story is that on one wall, this is Palazzo Vecchio, just to give you a sense of where you are. On one wall, Leonardo was to create this image of the Battle of Anghiari. It was a conflict between Milan and Florence, where Florence actually won for once. So they wanted to highlight this. And on the other side, they were going to bring in a very illustrious young up-and-comer. So Leonardo basically creates this image, and I'm showing you this. This is a copy by Peter Paul Rubens because it's never completed, and we don't really know what it looked like. This is probably the best drawing of a section of it. And we have these wonderful drawings, though, that Leonardo did, and you know that he's getting these images of warriors from the time when he was with Cesare Borgia, when Cesare is trying to conquer these small provinces. So he's learned about actual warfare. He's seen it. And these are some of the drawings. But of course, the image is never realized. And you can see there's lots of ideas about the use of horses and the use of energy. But ultimately, Leonardo doesn't finish the project. Vasari is hired to paint over it. And many people have urged the town of Florence to remove the Vasari painting to see what's underneath. But they're too afraid that it may have suffered a similar fate of the Last Supper. But who's the young up-and-comer who's looking over the shoulder of Leonardo? No one other than Michelangelo. So, they always say if you really want to get product out of someone, you put their biggest rival in the same room and let them go at it. And of course, Michelangelo, his project is never realized. We only know of it through drawings because he's called by the Pope. But these two will have a rivalry during this time that will really be the talk of Florence. And then the final image that he does before leaving Florence, before we get to the big one, is my favorite drawing by Leonardo. It's called La Scapigliata, which is the woman with the messy hair. And she's just the most beautiful image. She just emerges out of this very sort of ethereal glow. It's really a tour de force. It's in Parma, if you ever get to Parma to see it. So, leaves Florence in 1506, but he doesn't leave empty-handed. He will move around. He'll be back in Milan. He'll go down to Rome and ultimately go up to France, and he will take someone with him. Can anyone guess who I'm talking about? The Mona Lisa. Yes, this is the scene. Although I don't know now, maybe with Corona you can be alone with the Mona Lisa, but certainly the great work that Leonardo does during his time in Florence, and of course it's a marvelous image that speaks to and brings all of his past work together. So the ideas of Ginevra and turning her towards you, this engagement with the personality of Cecilia Gaderani, and sort of allowing you to sort of see these women as individuals. And of course, also, she too, Mona Lisa, is not an aristocrat. She's 24 years old. She's married to a merchant. She was from a landed family. The marriage was arranged to sort of allow his family to benefit hers through financial support. And she bears 2 sons to her husband. And then he, we believe, commissions Leonardo to create this portrait. But of course, Leonardo never lets her go and keeps her with him throughout his entire life. It's a marvelous example of all of the techniques, as I said, not just learned from the portraits, but also from earlier paintings and drawings, the use of the sfumato, the incredible background, really giving you a sense of Mona Lisa as a living, breathing individual. Now, one of the things that you'll notice, and the show, she wasn't in the show. They had a wonderful virtual reality that I'll show you an image of that brought her to life. But people are always amazed by the Mona Lisa smile. Why is her smile so provocative? Why is it so mysterious? And there's a very specific reason for this. So here's our mysterious landscape that we've been seeing over and over again. Go back to that drawing from Tuscany. Leonardo bringing in this almost surreal scape. You'll notice that this part of the landscape is lower than this part, right? It doesn't match up. So immediately, your eye moves more towards this area. You'll also notice that the light source doesn't really make sense, but it seems to be coming from this direction. So you're highlighting more on this side with shadows over here, right? And these shadows create this continuous movement upward, right? And so between the shadows, the continuous movement, the landscape, and the 32 layers of paint, which are just these faint layers, where he has studied from his dissection with the 100-year-old man, the muscles of the lip. And he understands how the muscles work to suggest a smile. And that's the secret of the smile. It comes from this technique of this sense of continuous movement, an awareness of light and shade, and the dynamic use of the landscape in the background. Now the painting, people have looked at it. It's hard to see, and the reason it's hard to see is that it's not in great condition. I mean, it could very much use a treatment like the Virgin and St. Anne had, but they're not allowed to take it down. It only leaves its place in the Louvre once a year, and can you imagine being the person in restoration who has to touch the Mona Lisa? It's terrifying. But they did do this, which I thought was interesting, to sort of, you see her a little differently in the reflectogram, I think. You sort of, again, it sort of jolts you. And then they had this, I thought it was going to be hokey, but I loved it. They had a virtual reality where they turned her into, and she would be breathing and smiling and winking. And it was really fun. I thought it was great. And I said to Vincent at the end, I said, I thought that virtual reality was not going to work. But unfortunately, I don't think it's still, you had to do it when you were at the show. And they also created this vista. And this is, of course, when Leonardo's studying the birds and the idea of flying apparatuses. So the idea was that he's envisioning flying over his landscape as Mona Lisa watches. So it was good. I liked it. But again, why is this such an important painting? It's because he basically takes the traditions of Florence, of the Renaissance, of the Quattrocento, of the woman as a site of display. And here is Battista Sforza looking squarely at her husband. What does he do with that? He gets rid of all of it. He gets rid of the jewels. He gets rid of the hairstyle. He gets rid of the landscape identifiable as Urbino. He basically turns the Mona Lisa towards you, puts down her hair, basically puts her in a very beautiful but very subtle garment and allows her to engage with you. So the idea, the eye is the window of the human body through which the soul contemplates and enjoys the beauty of the world. That's what makes this painting so fantastic and so special. And I have to say that I think once you know that, you can approach her in a way that's very personal. If you can sort of push past the crowds and engage with her, it really is a painting that deserves the accolades that it does. And of course, Raphael looked at this, and Raphael then takes the next step into the high Renaissance. Now, I only have a few minutes, so I'm going to be very quick with old St. Jerome here. But St. Jerome was a work, as I said, that was started in 1480 and then finished again in 1510. Now, normally St. Jerome is shown as the man who basically translates the Bible from Greek to Latin. The Vulgate Bible, he's usually shown in his studio with his very friendly lion. The lion has this great story about St. Jerome. St. Jerome is in his monastery, and all the monks come running and screaming, and there's a lion chasing them, and the lion comes and hops up on St. Jerome's desk, and St. Jerome sees a thorn in his paw and removes it, and the lion is his best friend. So you always see the lion with St. I always tell my students, you're trying to guess between St. Jerome and St. Ambrose. If there's a lion, go with Jerome. It's a good way to know it. But rather than showing him in his desk, in his study, with his books and with his, all of his attributes, Leonardo shows him bare, shows him out in the desert, basically doing penance for a life of sin and regret and all of the things that you really do contemplate when you reach a certain age. And of course, he comes back to do the drawings, he comes back to do the painting after he's done the dissection of the 100-year-old man, and he's learned about, looked at the Last Supper to show gesture, he's learned about the various muscles, but he wants to give you this feeling of the landscape in the back. This painting has been through hell and back. It was actually cut to just sell the head because it's not non finito. But it really is, and there's our lion down here, but it really is a marvelous example, I think, of Leonardo's process, of someone who's constantly searching, constantly looking, and how Florence, he starts in Florence with this painting, and then when he leaves Florence, he picks it back up. So to me, it seems to speak to his searching for what was his life all about and what does it mean. Now he leaves us, goes to France where he's buried in Amboise, but I think even though the French claim him, I think his heart resides in Florence. So with that, thank you so very much. I apologize because I was told 40 minutes, and I think we have to be out of here at 8 o'clock. It was my shameless way of avoiding any questions. But does anybody have anything they'd like to ask Leonardo, Met? Just don't ask me about the coronavirus. Any questions? Please give generously to the New Canaan Library. It's a wonderful organization. I'm a big supporter of libraries, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the week.